Henry Mitchell believed he had finally found the perfect wife in the Philippines, a gentle woman who would fill the emptiness in his Seattle home with love and devotion. But beneath her sweet smile and caring touch lay secrets so dark and twisted that discovering the truth would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the woman sleeping beside him. Henry's hands shook as he stared at his computer screen at 3 in the morning. The dating website showed 17 new messages, but only one mattered. Rosemary had sent another photo, this time of her cooking dinner in her small kitchen, smiling at the camera like she was looking right at him. For 6 months, they had been talking every day. She was different from the American women who never replied to his messages or rolled their eyes when he mentioned wanting a family. The rain pounded against his Seattle apartment windows. Henry worked as a software engineer, made good money, owned his own place. But at 38, he came home to silence every night. His last girlfriend had left him 2 years ago, saying he was too boring and not ambitious enough. The words still stung like fresh cuts. Rosemary never called him boring. She laughed at his jokes about programming. She asked about his day and actually listened to his answers. When he told her about his dream of having kids someday, she didn't change the subject. Instead, she talked about the children she wanted, 2 or 3, maybe 4 if God blessed them. "I work at a call center here in Manila," she had told him during one of their video calls. "The money is not so good, but I help my family. My mama is sick, and my younger brother goes to college. Life is hard here, Henry, but I have hope." Her hope became his hope. Henry started planning a trip to the Philippines. He researched flights, hotels, even learned a few words in Tagalog to surprise her. His coworkers thought he was crazy. Online relationships never work. His friend Jake warned him over lunch, especially with women from other countries. They just want green cards. But Jake had never seen how Rosemary's eyes lit up when Henry appeared on her screen. He hadn't heard her soft voice saying, "Good morning, my love," in that sweet accent that made Henry's heart race. Jake was just jealous because his own wife nagged him constantly about money and complained about everything. The flight to Manila took 18 hours. Henry barely slept, too excited and nervous. He had sent Rosemary money twice, once when her mother needed medicine, and another time when her family couldn't pay their electric bill. Each time, she cried with gratitude and promised to pay him back someday. Henry didn't want the money back. He wanted to take care of her. When he finally walked out of the airport in Manila, the heat hit him like opening an oven door. The air smelled like car exhaust mixed with food he couldn't identify. Hundreds of people pushed past him, talking in languages he didn't understand. For a moment, panic crept up his throat. What if this was all a mistake? Then he saw her. Rosemary stood behind the barrier, wearing a yellow dress that made her look like sunshine. She was smaller than he expected, maybe 5 feet tall, with long black hair and skin the color of coffee with cream. When their eyes met, her face broke into the biggest smile he had ever seen. She jumped up and down, waving both hands above her head. "Henry, Henry, over here." His nervousness melted away. This was real. She was real. They hugged for a long time, and she felt perfect in his arms, soft and warm and right. She smelled like flowers and something sweet he couldn't name. "You're even more handsome than in the pictures," she said, looking up at him with eyes that sparkled like stars. Henry blushed. No one had ever called him handsome before. Their first dinner together was at a small restaurant near his hotel. Rosemary ordered for both of them, explaining each dish with excitement. The food was spicier than anything Henry had ever eaten, but he pretended to love it because it made her happy. "Try the lumpia," she said, placing a spring roll on his plate. "My grandmother's recipe is better, but this is still good." She told him stories about growing up in the Philippines, about helping her mother sell vegetables in the market when she was little, about working hard in school even though her family was poor. Henry found himself hanging on every word. "You're so different from American women," he said without thinking. Rosemary tilted her head. "Different how? You care about family. You work hard. You're grateful for things." Henry paused, then added quietly, "You're not always angry or demanding more." Something flickered across Rosemary's face, but it was gone so fast Henry thought he imagined it. Family is everything in the Philippines, she said. We take care of each other. That's why I need to find a good husband who understands this. The word husband made Henry's stomach flip with excitement. After dinner, they walked around the shopping mall nearby. Everything felt like a dream. The bright lights, the crowds of people, Rosemary's small hand in his. She stopped at a jewelry store and admired a simple gold necklace in the window. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Henry checked the price tag. $50. Not expensive by American standards, but he remembered what she said about money being tight. Without hesitation, he bought it for her. Rosemary's eyes filled with tears as he fastened it around her neck. "No one has ever bought me jewelry before," she said. "You're so kind, Henry. So generous." That night, Henry lay in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, too happy to sleep. Tomorrow, Rosemary would take him to meet her family. He imagined Sunday dinners with kids running around, teaching his future children to ride bikes, growing old with someone who actually loved him. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, he didn't see Rosemary 3 floors below in the hotel lobby, talking rapidly on her phone in Tagalog, her voice urgent and businesslike, nothing like the soft sweetness she used with him. The Cruz family compound looked like a maze of concrete boxes stacked on top of each other. Henry counted at least 6 different roof lines and what seemed like dozens of windows, some with glass, others covered by metal sheets. A high wall topped with broken glass surrounded the property, and the heavy metal gate creaked when Rosemary's cousin unlocked it. "Welcome to our home," Rosemary said, squeezing Henry's hand. "Everyone is so excited to meet you." The excitement was obvious. At least 15 people waited in the main room, from tiny children to elderly grandparents. They all stared at Henry like he was a movie star who had wandered into their living room. The children whispered and giggled behind their hands. Rosemary's mother, Luz, was a stern-looking woman with graying hair pulled back tight. She spoke no English, but her handshake was firm and her eyes studied Henry like she was trying to see inside his soul. "Mama says you are very tall," Rosemary translated. "She wants to know if all Americans are giants." Henry laughed nervously. "Tell her I'm actually short for an American." This caused an explosion of chatter in Tagalog. Rosemary translated bits and pieces. They were asking about his job, his family, his house, his car. Every answer seemed to create more excited conversation. Breakfast was a production. Aunts and cousins brought dish after dish, rice, fish, vegetables Henry couldn't identify, and fruit that tasted like nothing he'd ever experienced. Everyone watched him eat, nodding approvingly when he tried new things and laughing when he reached for water after biting something too spicy. "You like Filipino food?" asked Carlo, Rosemary's teenage brother. His English was better than the others. "It's delicious," Henry said, even though his tongue felt like it was on fire. "Good," said Uncle Roberto, a man with calloused hands and a serious expression. "Because Filipino wife cook Filipino food." Everyone laughed, including Rosemary, but Henry noticed her laugh came a second too late. After breakfast, the family peppered Henry with questions about America. How much did houses cost? What about cars? Was it true that everyone had credit cards? How much money did software engineers make? "They're just curious," Rosemary explained when Henry looked uncomfortable. "Most of them have never met an American before, but their curiosity felt different from simple interest. Felt like an interview or maybe an inspection." Later, when the crowd thinned out, Luz pulled Rosemary aside for a long conversation in rapid Tagalog. Henry caught a few words he recognized. Pera meant money. Casal meant marriage. The conversation got heated, with Luz pointing at Henry several times while Rosemary shook her head and responded in what sounded like arguments. "Everything okay?" Henry asked when Rosemary returned to his side. "Mama worries," Rosemary said, her smile looking forced. "She asks if you are serious about marriage, or if you just want a vacation girlfriend." Henry's heart jumped. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you are a good man who wants a family, but she says American men sometimes make promises they don't keep." That afternoon, Rosemary showed Henry around her neighborhood. They walked down narrow streets between houses that looked like they might fall down in the next strong wind. Children followed them everywhere, calling out, "Hello, Joe," and giggling when Henry waved back. "They call all Americans Joe," Rosemary explained. "From the old days with American soldiers." They stopped at a small store where Rosemary bought sodas. The shopkeeper, an old woman with missing teeth, talked to Rosemary in Tagalog while staring at Henry. When they left, Rosemary was quiet. "She asked if you're my boyfriend," Rosemary finally said. "I told her maybe more than boyfriend." Henry's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" Rosemary stopped walking and looked up at him with those big dark eyes. "It means I think you could be my husband, if you want to be." The words hit Henry like lightning. Here was this beautiful, sweet woman talking about marriage after knowing him for just 6 months online and 2 days in person. In America, women wanted to date for years before even moving in together. "I would like that," Henry heard himself say. "I would like that very much." Rosemary threw her arms around his neck and kissed him right there in the street. The children who had been following them cheered and clapped. That evening, Henry was officially introduced to the extended family. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and neighbors crowded into the small living room. Someone had cooked a whole pig, and there was more food than Henry had ever seen outside a restaurant. "This is Henry," Rosemary announced in English, then repeated it in Tagalog. "He is my American boyfriend, and maybe soon more than boyfriend." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Men shook Henry's hand so hard his arm hurt. Women hugged him and pinched his cheeks. Children climbed on his lap and asked him to teach them English words. But in the middle of all the celebration, Henry noticed something strange. While everyone was congratulating Rosemary and asking him questions about America, he saw her slip away to the back of the house with Carlo and 2 older men he hadn't met before. They talked in hushed, urgent voices, and one of the men kept pulling out his phone and showing the others something on the screen. When Rosemary returned 20 minutes later, her smile seemed brighter than before, but something in her eyes had changed. It was like someone had flipped a switch inside her head. "Sorry," she said, sitting back down next to Henry. "Uncle needed to discuss family business." "What kind of business?" "Boring stuff," she said quickly. "Money for Mama's medicine, Carlo's school fees. Family problems." But Henry noticed that Carlo was grinning now like he'd just won the lottery, and the older men kept looking at Henry and nodding approvingly. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened during those 20 minutes. Something that involved him, even though he hadn't been part of the conversation. He tried to push the feeling away. Rosemary's family liked him. She wanted to marry him. Everything was going exactly the way he'd dreamed. So why did he feel like he was missing something important? Outside his window, Manila hummed with night sounds. Traffic, music, voices calling out in languages he didn't understand. Somewhere in that maze of lights and sounds, Rosemary was probably lying in her small bed, thinking about their future together. Henry fell asleep with a smile on his face, never knowing that 3 floors below, the hotel's business center computer was being used to research American immigration laws, marriage visa requirements, and the average net worth of software engineers in Seattle. Henry's credit card statement arrived on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. As he sipped his coffee in the kitchen of his Seattle home, the number at the bottom made him choke. $8,247.62. Just 3 months after bringing Rosemary to America, his careful savings were disappearing faster than ice in summer. "Honey, you okay?" Rosemary called from upstairs, where she was getting ready for her English classes at the community center. "Fine," Henry lied, stuffing the bill into his laptop bag. He didn't want to worry her. She was trying so hard to fit into American life, and money stress would only make things harder. The house felt different now. Rosemary had transformed their quiet neighborhood home into something that buzzed with constant activity. Her brother Carlo had arrived 2 weeks after the wedding, claiming he needed help getting into college. Then cousin Mira showed up with 2 suitcases and tears in her eyes, saying her boyfriend in the Philippines had thrown her out. "Family helps family," Rosemary explained whenever Henry looked overwhelmed by the growing crowd. "This is temporary, my love. Just until they find their feet." but temporary seemed to stretch longer each day. Carlo spent his time playing video games instead of looking for work. Mira cooked elaborate Filipino meals that used ingredients Henry couldn't pronounce and couldn't afford. The grocery bills had tripled. Henry's neighbor Jake cornered him while he was taking out the trash. "No offense, man, but your place is turning into a boarding house," Jake said, lowering his voice. "My wife counted 6 different people coming and going yesterday. You sure you know what you're doing?" "They're family," Henry replied, but the words felt thin even to him. That evening, Henry found Rosemary crying in their bedroom. Her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke rapid Tagalog. When she saw him, she quickly ended the call and wiped her eyes. "What's wrong?" Henry asked, sitting beside her on the bed. "Mama called," Rosemary sobbed. "Papa is in the hospital. His heart is bad and they need money for surgery. 20,000 pesos, but we don't have it." Henry did quick math in his head. 20,000 pesos was about $400. Not a huge amount, but added to everything else. "How much is the surgery in American money?" he asked. $400, Rosemary whispered. "I know it's a lot, but Henry, he's my father. I can't let him die because we don't have money." Looking at his wife's tear-streaked face, Henry felt his heart break. How could he say no? What kind of husband would let his father-in-law die over $400? "Of course we'll help," he said, pulling her close. "I'll transfer the money tomorrow." Rosemary clung to him like he was her lifeline. "Thank you, my love. You're so good to my family. Papa will be so grateful." But as Henry held his crying wife, he noticed her phone screen was still lit up on the nightstand. The call log showed she'd been talking to someone named Miguel for 37 minutes. Not her mother. Before he could think about it too much, Rosemary grabbed the phone and turned it off. "Sorry," she said quickly. "I called my brother first to ask advice before calling you. Miguel is my cousin who works at the hospital." The explanation made sense, but something about it felt wrong. 2 weeks later, Henry discovered the second bank account. He was trying to balance their checkbook when he found a statement that had been delivered to their address but wasn't for any account he recognized. The name on it was R. Mitchell, Rosemary's married name, but Henry had never opened this account. His hands shook as he opened the statement. Regular deposits from their joint checking account, amounts that matched the emergency money he'd been sending to the Philippines. But the withdrawals didn't go to any Filipino bank. They went to cash advances at casinos in Tacoma, to expensive restaurants he'd never been to stores that sold jewelry and electronics. Henry stared at the numbers until they blurred together. Either someone had stolen Rosemary's identity, or his wife had been lying to him about everything. When Rosemary came home from her English class, Henry was sitting at the kitchen table with the bank statement spread out in front of him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosemary's face went white. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then the tears started. "I can explain," she sobbed, dropping into the chair across from him. "Please don't be angry. I was scared to tell you the truth." "What truth?" "The money wasn't all for Papa's surgery," she cried. "Some of it was for other things. Mama needed new medicine that's very expensive. Carlo's school wants more money for fees. My sister's baby got sick and needed special doctors." "But this says you took cash out at casinos," Henry said, pointing to the statement. No, you don't understand," Rosemary said frantically. "My cousin Miguel, he works there. It was easier to get the cash from him and send it to Philippines that way. The bank makes us wait too long for international transfers." The explanation sounded reasonable, but Henry's stomach felt like it was full of rocks. "Why didn't you tell me about this account?" "Because I knew you would worry," Rosemary whispered. "You work so hard, and I didn't want to stress you with every little family problem. I thought I could handle it myself." Looking at his wife's tearful face, Henry wanted to believe her. He loved her. She was his wife. People didn't lie to the people they loved, did they? "No more secrets," he said finally. "If your family needs money, we talk about it first. Together." Yes, of course," Rosemary nodded eagerly. "No more secrets. I promise." But that night, As Henry lay awake listening to Rosemary's soft breathing beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living with a stranger. The woman he'd married seemed to have more family emergencies than anyone could reasonably have. Her phone rang at all hours with calls she took in whispered Tagalog. And now there was a bank account he'd never known about. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe he didn't know what he was doing. In the darkness, Henry made a decision. Tomorrow, he would start paying closer attention to things. Not because he didn't trust Rosemary, but because something felt wrong, and he needed to understand what it was. What Henry didn't know was that downstairs, Carlo was wide awake too, typing furiously on his laptop. The screen showed a chat room full of other young Filipino men, all sharing stories about their sisters and cousins who had married American men. They traded tips about which emergencies worked best, which banks were easiest to open accounts with, and how long they could usually milk a situation before moving on to the next target. Carlo typed, "Phase 2 complete. The fish is hooked. Ready for Phase 3. The response came immediately, "Perfect. How much have you collected so far?" "About 12,000. But Miguel thinks we can get at least 30 before we have to burn this bridge. Good work. Remember, if he gets suspicious, we move to Plan B. Rosemary knows what to do." As Carlo closed the laptop and crept back upstairs, Henry's house settled into silence. But it was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, heavy with secrets and the promise of destruction. The police station smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. Henry's wrists burned where the handcuffs had been, red marks still visible even though they'd been removed an hour ago. Detective Rodriguez sat across from him in the small gray room, a pile of folders and photographs spread between them like evidence of crimes he couldn't understand. "Mr. Mitchell," Detective Rodriguez said, her voice flat and professional. "Your wife filed a domestic violence report against you yesterday morning. She claims you've been threatening her, controlling her money, and said you'd have her deported if she didn't do what you wanted." Henry's mouth fell open. "That's impossible. I would never hurt Rosemary. I love her. She has photos," Rodriguez continued, sliding a picture across the table. "Bruises on her arms, a black eye. She says this happened 3 days ago when you found out about some money she sent to her family." The photo showed Rosemary's face, swollen and purple around her left eye, tears streaming down her cheeks. Henry stared at it in shock. He remembered 3 days ago. They'd argued about money, yes, but he'd never touched her. He'd raised his voice, maybe, but violence? Never. "I didn't do this," Henry whispered. "I swear to you, I have never hit my wife." "She also claims you've been financially abusing her," Rodriguez said, opening another folder. "Forcing her to account for every penny, threatening to cut off money to her sick family members if she didn't obey your rules." "That's not what happened," Henry said desperately. "She was spending money without telling me. I found a secret bank account she'd opened using my social security number. I just wanted us to be honest with each other about finances." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You're saying your wife opened a bank account using your information without your permission? That would be identity theft, Mr. Mitchell. Did you report this to the bank?" Henry's stomach sank. "No, She explained it. She said it was easier for sending money to her family." "So you gave her permission to use your social security number?" "Not exactly, but—" Henry trailed off, realizing how weak it sounded. The detective opened another file. "We also have reports from your neighbors about loud arguments coming from your house. Shouting, things being thrown. Mrs. Jenkins next door says she was concerned enough to almost call police herself last week." Henry remembered the argument Rodriguez was talking about. He discovered another $500 charge on their credit card for something Rosemary claimed was a medical emergency for her grandmother. When he'd questioned her about it, she'd gotten defensive. And yes, their voices had gotten loud. But he'd never thrown anything. Had he? "Mr. Mitchell," Rodriguez continued, "domestic violence often starts with financial control and verbal abuse before it becomes physical. Your wife's story fits a very common pattern." "But I'm the victim here," Henry said, his voice cracking. "She's been lying to me, stealing from me. I've given her family thousands of dollars for emergencies that I'm starting to think never existed. Do you have proof these emergencies were fake? Henry realized he didn't. He'd never asked for hospital records or receipts. He'd trusted his wife. Here's what's going to happen, Rodriguez said, gathering the photos. We're releasing you today because your wife has decided not to press charges. But there's a restraining order in place. You cannot go within 500 feet of your wife or your home. You cannot contact her directly or through others. Violate this order, and you'll be arrested immediately. She's in my house, Henry protested. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem, Rodriguez replied. You can collect some personal items later today, but only with police escort. I suggest you find a lawyer and a hotel room. As Henry walked out of the police station into the gray Seattle afternoon, his mind reeled. How had his life turned upside down so quickly? 2 days ago, he'd been a married man with a home and a future. Now he was homeless, broke, and facing accusations that could destroy his career. His phone had 17 missed calls from work. His boss would want explanations he didn't have. His neighbors would whisper and stare. His family would hear about this and wonder what kind of man he really was. The hotel room Henry could afford was a grimy place near the airport. The sheets smelled like cigarettes, and the heater made noise like a dying animal. As he sat on the lumpy bed, Henry tried to piece together what had gone wrong. Had he been controlling? Maybe. He'd wanted to know where their money was going, but that seemed reasonable for a married couple. Had he been threatening? He'd told Rosemary that they needed to be honest about finances or their marriage wouldn't work. Was that a threat? The more Henry thought about it, the more confused he became. Every conversation with Rosemary seemed to have two possible meanings. Every argument could be seen as either reasonable discussion or abusive control, depending on who was telling the story. His phone rang. Unknown number. Henry. The voice was familiar but wrong somehow. Rosemary? Henry's heart jumped. Are you okay? Are you hurt? I'm scared, she whispered. The police told me not to call you, but I had to. I want to come home, Henry. I want us to fix this. Where are you? Are you safe? I'm staying with friends from church. Henry, I'm sorry about the police. I was just so scared when you got angry about the money. I thought you might hurt me. I would never hurt you, Henry said desperately. You know that, right? I love you. I know, baby. I was just scared. Can we meet somewhere? Can we talk? Henry's heart raced. This was exactly what the restraining order said he couldn't do. But this was his wife asking for help, wanting to fix their marriage. Where? He heard himself ask. The coffee shop where we had our first date when I came to America. You remember? Tonight at 8. Rosemary, the restraining order. No one has to know, she whispered. Just us talking, trying to save our marriage. After she hung up, Henry stared at his phone for a long time. Everything inside him screamed that this was a trap, but the voice had sounded like the woman he'd fallen in love with. Scared, lonely, wanting to come home. At 7:45 that evening, Henry sat in his car outside the coffee shop, watching the door. This was probably the stupidest thing he'd ever done. But he couldn't lose Rosemary without fighting for their marriage. What Henry didn't see was the police car parked in the alley behind the shop, or Detective Rodriguez adjusting the recording equipment in her unmarked vehicle, or Rosemary sitting in the passenger seat next to her, practicing her lines one more time. Remember, Rodriguez said quietly, get him to admit he threatened you or your family. Get him to say something about controlling the money. We need him to incriminate himself. Rosemary nodded, checking her appearance in the mirror. The makeup around her eye had been carefully applied to look like fading bruises. He'll believe me, she said confidently. Henry always believes me. As Henry walked into the coffee shop, he had no idea he was walking into the final act of a performance that had been planned for months. All he knew was that he loved his wife and would do anything to save their marriage, even if it destroyed him. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Henry's new apartment, casting thin golden lines across the hardwood floor he had chosen himself. 6 months had passed since the coffee shop meeting that had nearly destroyed what remained of his life. 6 months since Detective Rodriguez had played him the recording of Rosemary's phone call, revealing how she had orchestrated their meeting to gather evidence for additional charges that never came. Henry sat at his small kitchen table, steam rising from his coffee cup like incense in a quiet church. The apartment was smaller than his old house, but every item in it belonged to him alone. No religious statues he didn't understand. No family photos of people who had never been family. No constant chatter in a language designed to exclude him. The silence felt like freedom. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Rachel in Portland. "Still coming for Thanksgiving next week?" Henry smiled as he typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." The words felt different now than they would have a year ago. Then, accepting family invitations had felt like admitting failure, like broadcasting his loneliness to people who had their lives figured out. Now it felt like choosing connection over isolation, choosing people who knew him over strangers who performed love. Through his window, Henry watched his elderly neighbor Mrs. Chun tend to her small garden. She waved when she caught him looking, and he waved back. Simple, honest, no agenda hidden beneath the gesture. The lawsuit against Rosemary had stalled in bureaucratic limbo. She had returned to the Philippines with money that Henry would likely never see again, protected by distance and the complexities of international law. But somewhere along the path from rage to acceptance, Henry had discovered that recovering the money mattered less than recovering himself. Dr. Kim had helped him understand that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about learning to trust his own instincts again, recognizing red flags he had ignored, and understanding that love didn't require the sacrifice of self-respect. "You weren't stupid," Dr. Kim had told him during one of their sessions. "You were lonely and hopeful. Those aren't character flaws, Henry. They're human traits that someone exploited." The support group had been harder. Sitting in a circle with other men who had similar stories, Henry had felt ashamed at first. How had they all fallen for variations of the same script? But listening to their experiences, he realized that the shame belonged to the people who had manipulated them, not to the victims who had dared to love. David from the group had become an unexpected friend. They met for coffee every 2 weeks, not to rehash their stories but to talk about moving forward. David was learning to cook. Henry had started hiking again, something he'd abandoned when Rosemary complained that outdoor activities were boring. The hiking trails in the Cascade Mountains had become Henry's cathedral. Walking through forests that had stood for centuries, breathing air that tasted like pine and possibility, he found a peace that no relationship had ever given him. The mountains didn't need him to be different than he was. They didn't require payment for their beauty or loyalty for their constancy. On one particularly difficult day, when memories of Rosemary's laugh felt more real than the present moment, Henry had climbed to a viewpoint overlooking Elliott Bay. The city spread below him like a circuit board, millions of lights representing millions of people navigating their own searches for connection. He had felt part of something larger than, not separate from it. That evening, Henry received an email that made his hands shake. The sender was Michael Torres, and the subject line read, "Warning about Rosemary Cruz." Michael's story was Henry's story told in different details. A lonely software engineer from San Diego. 3 months of online courtship. A trip to the Philippines. A whirlwind romance followed by financial bleeding. Family emergencies that never ended. A secret bank account. False domestic violence charges. The only difference was timing. Michael was living through what Henry had survived. "I found your name in some court records," Michael wrote. "I know this is probably painful to relive, but I need to know if what I'm experiencing is real or if I'm going crazy. Did she tell you about her father's heart surgery? Her grandmother's funeral? Her brother's college fees?" Henry stared at the email for a long time. Rosemary was running the same playbook with someone else, perhaps had been running it with others all along. The emergencies Henry had believed were unique family crises were actually a carefully crafted script, tested and refined through repetition. Instead of anger, Henry felt something unexpected. Compassion, not just for Michael, but for all the lonely people who would believe Rosemary's performance because they wanted love more than they wanted truth. And surprisingly, even compassion for Rosemary herself. a woman so disconnected from authentic connection that she could only experience it through manipulation. Henry wrote back to Michael, offering to meet if he was ever in Seattle. Not to seek revenge or plan retribution, but to share what he had learned about rebuilding after betrayal. About the difference between being alone and being lonely. About the strange freedom that came from discovering you could survive your worst fears. The next weekend, Henry drove to his old neighborhood to drop off some mail that had been forwarded to him. His former house looked different with someone else living in it. The new owners had painted the trim and planted different flowers. The lemon tree Rosemary had insisted on buying was heavy with fruit, thriving without her care. Mrs. Jenkins from next door approached him as he got back in his car. "Henry, I'm sorry about what happened," she said awkwardly. "I want you to know that I never believed those stories about you hurting her. You were always such a quiet, kind neighbor." "Thank you," Henry replied, and meant it. "That means more than you know." Driving away from his old life, Henry felt the last piece of something heavy lift from his chest. The neighborhood held no power over him anymore. The house was just a building. The memories were just experiences he had survived. That evening, Henry opened his laptop and began writing in the journal Dr. Kim had encouraged him to keep. Tonight's entry began, "I used to think love meant being chosen by someone else. Now I understand it means choosing myself first." He wrote about learning to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between love and performance, between generosity and exploitation. He wrote about the quiet strength that came from setting boundaries, the peace that followed accepting truth, and the unexpected joy of discovering that he was enough, all by himself. Outside his window, Seattle hummed with its eternal rhythm of traffic and sirens and life continuing. 800,000 people pursuing their own versions of happiness, most of them probably feeling alone sometimes, all of them trying to figure out how to love and be loved without losing themselves in the process. Henry closed the laptop and made himself a simple dinner, pasta with vegetables, nothing elaborate, but food he had chosen because he liked it. He ate slowly, tasting each bite, grateful for the ability to nourish himself without having to negotiate or explain or justify. Tomorrow he would wake up in his own space, make his own choices, follow his own plans. He would go to work where colleagues respected his skills, not his bank account. He would call his sister to finalize Thanksgiving plans with family who loved him without conditions. He might drive to the mountains if the weather was clear, or read a book if it wasn't, or simply exist without having to perform happiness for anyone else's benefit. The simplicity of it felt revolutionary. Before bed, Henry stood at his window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere in those lights were other people learning to love themselves again after betrayal. Others discovering that the end of one story could be the beginning of a better one. Others finding out that the person they were before they tried to become what someone else wanted was actually pretty wonderful. Henry smiled at his reflection in the glass. The man looking back at him was older than the one who had flown to Manila full of hope and desperation. This man had scars but also wisdom. He had been broken, but he had also learned to rebuild himself stronger. "I'm okay," Henry said quietly to his reflection. "I'm actually okay." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he meant it completely.